It looks like protein powder is back on the meal plan, boys. A new meta-analysis recommends protein intakes as high as 1.5 grams per pound of total body weight per day. That's 3.2 grams per kilogram, again, of total body weight per day. In this video, I'm gonna look at this new meta-analysis to see how much sense these recommendations make, if you should consume them, and at the end, I'm going to go into 2 additional findings that the new meta-analysis found, which have flew under the radar of most people discussing this, and I think are extremely important for most of you to know. This new study was a meta-analysis of 29 other studies, which means they basically looked at kind of the average effect that we see of protein intake on fat-free mass changes, so basically our gains. Fat-free mass is used as a proxy for muscle growth in this context. Importantly, they looked at studies of non-obese individuals in energy deficit, so they were cutting, and they were strength trainees already before the study. Although the requirements only mandated that they had 3 months of resistance training experience, so many of the individuals were absolute novices. And the researchers looked at protein intakes over a range of 0.8 gram per kilogram up to 3.2 grams per kilogram. And they found that there was a positive association between protein intake and gains in fat-free mass in this range. The best model was a linear fit, which means that higher protein intakes result in more gains with no seeming limit. And therefore, the researchers concluded that very serious trainees who care a lot about their muscle mass should consume the higher end of this range. So bodybuilders, for example, should consume as much as 1.5 gram per kilogram, 50% more than even the bro bodybuilding wisdom of 1 gram per pound. Now you might be wondering what researchers came to these preposterous recommendations, but they are actually some of the best researchers in the field. Martin Ruffalo, the lead author, is an up-and-comer. I've not personally met him, but he seems like a great guy, and I've read multiple of his studies already. Eric Trexler is definitely a great guy. I've talked to him many times, great researcher. Eric Helms, I've known for a very long time, and I consider a friend. I've met him personally many times. Great guy. I have absolutely nothing bad to say about these researchers. But I do not agree with their analysis, and in particular, the recommendations that flow from their analysis in this particular paper. My key beef in this case is that a positive association in a certain range does not mean that you should be consuming the upper end of that range for maximum benefit. The range went as low as 0.8 gram per kilogram per day. We know that there are benefits to higher protein intakes than that. So of course there's going to be some positive association between that low of an intake and higher intakes than that. What we are really interested in is what the break point is. In our earlier meta-analysis of this research, we found that the break point, although in slightly different subjects, was 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. The new meta-analysis did not perform a breakpoint analysis, so technically all this analysis shows is that there are benefits above 0.8 gram per kilogram, which is just the intake for sedentary individuals. And in that sense, the analysis teaches us nothing like truly novel. The reason that the researchers still recommend that we go up to the top of this range is that the best fit in the data was a linear model. Instead of a breakpoint analysis, the researchers compared a linear model to a quadratic or a cubic model. Now, if I have you think of the relationship between protein intake and our gains, what type of relationship are we thinking about? Do you think the relationship is linear, whereby it's just the more protein you consume, the better your gains, and there's no cutoff point? Do you think that's reasonable? Probably not, right? Do you think it's reasonable that the relationship would be quadratic? So maybe it goes up at first and then it kind of plateaus and then it goes down. If you start consuming super high protein intakes, your gains start to suffer until they're just as bad as at a low protein intake. Probably also not, right? That would be something like a quadratic relationship. Or do you think the relationship would be cubic, which would entail that there are maybe inflection points and minimum and maxima along the curve. So maybe your gains start increasing at first and they taper off and then they go up again, something like that? Probably not, right? I'm guessing that the vast majority of you think of a diminishing returns curve, where you consume protein intake. Up to a certain point, there are benefits for muscle growth, but at a certain point, enough is enough. You just can't eat your way to the Mr. Olympia. You have to also do strength training, and there are a lot of other factors that influence how much muscle we build. Protein alone is just gonna have some maximum at some point, and we also see this in research. It's called the muscle full effect, which sounds like pseudoscience, but that's the actual term in nutritional sciences. It means that there is a limit to how much protein synthesis we can stimulate because, you just can't grow infinitely in a single meal or in a single day. So you would probably expect a curve like Heligas, which is basically what we found with our breakpoint analysis, although A breakpoint analysis can also be argued to be a little bit crude if you do it in a linear fashion. At least it stimulates the idea that we are looking for some point at which additional protein intake no longer benefits muscle growth. That was not done in the current study, and the researchers, because they only looked at 3 models, none of which makes any theoretical sense, honestly, they chose the one that just best fit the data instead of best fit theory. And as a result of that, they picked the linear model, which is all defensible in statistical terms, but I think just doesn't make a lot of sense. So assuming it would be a linear relationship, indeed it would be that more is better. But if you are going to recommend more is better on a linear relationship, then the cutoff point of your recommendation is simply going to be influenced by the maximum protein intake in the dataset. Imagine there had been one more study with a protein intake as high as 5 grams per kilogram, or 2 grams per pound. In that case, the relationship between protein intake and our gains would probably have been basically the same. One additional study is not going to change the dataset or the analysis outcomes by a meaningful degree. So we would have the same outcomes, still a linear positive relationship, but now the range goes up to 5 or 2 grams per pound. And then they would recommend that range, right? You see where I'm going? And if there was another study which had 3 grams per pound of protein intake, again, the relationship and the regression outcomes would probably have been the same, and then the recommendation would have been, oh, so we have to go all the way up to 3 grams per kilogram. Without a breakpoint analysis or fitting the data to some type of logarithmic or asymptotic curve that can capture the diminishing returns effect, we don't know what the maximum point is at which protein intake starts no longer being beneficial for muscle growth. That's what we're really interested in, and unfortunately that was not adequately tested in this analysis. So without any type of breakpoint analysis or looking for some asymptotic curve, essentially all what the analysis shows is that higher protein intakes above the minimum are beneficial. That's not very surprising. Another major limitation to the analysis is that only 5 studies were originally found based on the stringent selection criteria. But because that was too few to conduct a proper meta-analysis, the researchers expanded their criteria and then found 29 studies. Unfortunately, and this is a limitation simply of the data that are available, when you have these 29 studies, you're looking at studies that don't even investigate the effects of higher versus lower protein intakes. You're looking at completely different studies. Some of these studies were on protein quality, some of them were on nutrient timing, some of them were on energy intake, some of them were on ketogenic dieting or intermittent fasting. So many of these studies are very hard to compare and have many confounding factors. In many of the comparisons between higher and lower protein intakes, in the studies that were actually even designed for this in the first place, there were also differences in meal frequency, nutrient timing, energy intake, protein quality, or any other confounding factor. So we're not just looking at the effect of protein intake here, we're looking at the effect of multiple other factors that we know influence muscle growth. One huge one is energy deficit. In this study, the researchers did look at the effect of energy deficit, but they did not do it in the best possible manner, in my view, because they looked at the effect of protein, and then they looked at the effect of protein plus a bunch of moderators, which included biological sex of the participants, energy deficit, and a bunch of other factors. They found that protein intake alone was actually a better fit. Again, this is an example of trusting the statistics over what makes sense. We have previous meta-analytic data and multiple studies showing that greater energy deficits influence fat-free mass change. Not very surprising, right? If you go into a massive energy deficit, the risk of muscle loss is greater than if you are in a small energy deficit. Regardless of what the statistics show, when we already know this as fact pretty much, and theory heavily supports it, you should keep this in the model. You cannot just blindly trust the statistics when the statistics tell you something that doesn't make any sense and is also not individually supported by well-controlled randomized trials. So that's, I think, a huge limitation, especially given how confounded the data set was. And to the researchers' 100% credit, the researchers did note that the meta-regression models presented are exploratory, as included studies may not have compared higher versus lower protein intakes in a controlled setting and involve intervention heterogeneity. The last part refers to the fact that many of the studies had habitual strength training, so the groups were not just different in the protein intake, but also in the type of strength training, like their volume, how hard they trained, etc. Another very big confounder. An exploratory analysis essentially means that it's more hypothesis generating and that you're just kind of exploring the data to come up with ideas for a more rigorous controlled trial. So that's not something the researchers are at fault for, but I think it massively limits how literally we have to take the results. Even if we ignore all of these limitations and we do take the results literally at face value, then we should look at the question, how much additional benefit are we getting when we increase our protein intake beyond, say, 1.8 gram per kilogram? Is it really worth it to go higher in protein intake? The answer to this from the researchers is increasing protein intake from the lowest 0.8 gram per kilogram to the highest 3.2 gram per kilogram. Analyzed intakes results in only a small effect size difference. So even if we go from the paltry lowest intake, which is basically for sedentary individuals, all the way up to the super high intake, 1.5 grams per pound, which is like, protein powder at lunch, dinner, and breakfast, then we're still looking at a small effect size difference for your gains. So when we're looking at just going from, say, 1 gram per pound or 1.8 gram per kilogram to a bit higher than that, you're looking at a very small effect size difference. And these effect sizes might actually be a bit of an overestimate because the researchers made a number of statistical choices that bias the results in favor of a stronger relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass gains. For example, they looked at energy deficits, and some of them were implausibly large, so they replaced those with the median, and they found that that resulted in improved model fit. Similarly, there were a couple of outlier studies, or outliers, because they were outliers only to the extent that they significantly influenced the effect sizes, and removing them improved the relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass change. Removing outliers because they improve the model in the sense that you want it to be, so they basically support your hypothesis, is not, in my view, how you should remove outliers. You should remove outliers based on predefined criteria, such as a value being over 2 standard deviations away from the median. That would be a reason not to include the specific study. But just not including a study because it does not confirm your hypothesis is basically data mining. That said, the analysis was overall very well conducted. I highly respect these researchers. I don't think there was any intentional type of cherry picking taking place, but it is a fact that these choices bias the results in favor of stronger relationships. So probably there would be even a slightly smaller effect. I don't think these would have a big effect or anything in the analysis, but it is a consideration when we're trying to extrapolate whether it's worth increasing your protein intake. By the way, do you like my content? Then you'll love my online PT certification course. Instead of spending 10 years sifting through misinformation and being confused by all the contradictory information on YouTube, in less than 1 year, you'll learn absolutely everything you need to know to transform your physique and, if you're a pro, the results of your clients. My research team and I have compiled quite literally all available information on muscle growth, fat loss, strength development, and health sciences into a practical take-home messages to take your physique to the next level. And we teach the methods that we ourselves actually use as coaches with our clients, ranging from Gen Pop to professional bodybuilders. You'll also get a PT toolkit with calculators, case studies, how-to guides, an exercise library, and hefty discounts to our partners' products and services. Of course, you shouldn't take my word for it. Check out the reviews of our former students in the link below. To my knowledge, we have the highest student satisfaction scores in the market. Okay, back to the video. There were 2 additional very cool findings in this meta-analysis. The first is that using fat-free mass to base your protein intake on instead of body weight was no more accurate at predicting the relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass changes. In other words, it does not appear to be worthwhile to go to the trouble of trying to estimate your body fat percentage, calculate your fat-free mass, and then basing your protein intake on your fat-free mass. Most people cannot accurately calculate their body fat percentage, most people dramatically underreport it, and most commercially available methods are not reliable at all, so it's probably not worth getting that level of unreliability and complexity to estimate your protein requirements. The model fit statistics, which are the most important things here, were virtually identical between protein based on body weight and protein based on fat-free mass. 54 to 55%, only a 1% difference in R squared, which is the explained variance of the model, and the standard error was exactly the same at 0.09. So there was really no difference between the relationship between protein intake based on body weight and fat-free mass and change in fat-free mass. Interestingly, the researchers still concluded that fat-free mass was better, but they did that based on a 2%, again a completely trivial, difference in the probability that additional protein intake benefited fat-free mass change. Again, this is biased in favor of assuming that there is a relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass, and that a stronger relationship means a better model. It fits the hypothesis better, but it doesn't actually fit the data better. What matters for whether the model is better is how well the model fits with the data. And that's things like R squared and standard error, which were virtually identical between the 2 considerations. Now, I agree that theoretically, fat-free mass makes more sense than total body weight, but the available research that has directly looked at this, which is very, very little research, does not find very significant effects of fat-free mass at all. The reason for that is probably that, yes, fat-free mass, like a kilo of muscle mass, is more metabolically active and requires more protein than a kilo of adipose tissue, like a kilo of body fat. But both of them completely pale in comparison to organ mass. Organ mass is by far the strongest predictor of protein requirements. A kilo of organ mass has a far higher protein requirement still than a kilo of muscle mass. Since organ mass scales with body weight and height in particular relatively stably, it just doesn't appear to be worthwhile to look at differences in 1 kilo of muscle mass. It's just like the effect of an additional kilo of muscle mass on your resting energy expenditure is not as large as some people would like to believe. So if you're not overweight, most people can simply use total body weight to calculate their protein requirements, and it's probably just as accurate. In fact, if you cannot reliably determine your body fat percentage, which most people can't, it might be less accurate to use fat-free mass because of the inaccuracy of knowing what your fat-free mass index is in the first place. Now, I will say that the effect of protein intake on fat-free mass change increased the lower the body fat percentage of the individuals was. But this was the case in both the models based on fat-free mass and body weight. So it may not be related to fat-free mass. It might be related to inherent risk of muscle loss at lower body fat percentages. The second really cool finding in this analysis is that they did a subgroup analysis of smaller and lower deficits, in this case below or above 300 kilocalories, and they found, interestingly, that the effect of protein intake, if anything, decreased when people were in higher deficit. So the thinking of most people in evidence-based fitness, myself actually not included, is that higher energy deficits warrant greater protein intakes because it has to offset the risk of muscle loss. That doesn't logically follow though, because protein intake and energy deficit likely have separate effects. Like there is only a certain amount of protein that your body will use, so you cannot necessarily compensate for excessive energy deficit by just consuming more protein. It has its own independent and negative effect. The limitation in that case is not protein availability, but the limitation is simply energy availability. And if that results in excess catabolism, it doesn't seem to be the case that additional protein can compensate for that. Either way, these results don't support the theory that higher protein intakes are required in energy deficit. I know that some people thought that this was the case in this meta-analysis because this meta-analysis finds seemingly high protein requirements, or at least the researchers recommend them, based on research on individuals in energy deficit, but they did not compare protein requirements in individuals outside of energy deficit and in energy deficit. So we cannot say that this analysis supports higher protein intakes in energy deficit. The subgroup analysis that most directly looked at this, if anything, found that the effect of protein intake on fat-free mass change decreased. So all in all, this analysis does not support that in energy deficit or greater energy deficits, we need higher protein requirements. Now, I might be inherently biased. I wrote an article a long time ago arguing that 1.8 gram per kilogram or 0.8 gram per pound of total body weight is the highest protein intake that's likely required to maximize your gains. This article at the time was based on over 20 studies and nitrogen balance data. And I know that Milo Wolf and Greg Knuckles have taken a subtle shot at me by saying that I rely on nitrogen balance data when there are newer, better methods available. There are newer, better methods available, but not when I wrote the article over a decade ago. This became quite a prominent article, which I became well known for. It ranked #1 on Google for a long time, and it had a big impact on the industry. It in part inspired the meta-analysis that I was a part of later, which found the exact same thing as the article, that there is no established research finding benefits over 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. So I recommended 1.8 before the meta-analysis already, and I stuck with that after the meta-analysis because it already includes a bit of a markup to account for uncertainty in the data. At the time I wrote the article, and even at the time the meta-analysis was published many years later, those were the most evidence-based guidelines based on the available data. I was the founder of Bayesian bodybuilding, the method of which highly relies on Bayesian thinking, which means that you update your beliefs based on new incoming knowledge. You have a prior based on the data that you already have, new evidence comes in, you update that to form your new belief that takes all the data into account. Since then, there has actually still not been a single well-controlled trial that has found significant benefits of protein intakes above 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. So what we're looking at here is whether we can extrapolate from individual studies that did not find significant benefits. Maybe there were some benefits that did not reach statistical significance, and with a meta-analysis we have more statistical power to tease out if maybe all these small differences were actually consistent enough that we can say there is in fact a difference to higher intakes than any controlled study has shown so far. Also, I would note that there have been some trials published that did find benefits of higher protein intakes, but all of them were confounded by nutrient timing and in most cases also energy surplus. So we cannot say whether it was the difference in energy intake, protein timing, or protein intake that made the higher protein intake group have greater gains in those studies. And going by memory, that's only 3 studies out of a total of about 90 studies if we don't control for confounders that have looked at this, many of which found that, in terms of statistical significance at least, even far lower protein intakes still optimized body recomposition and strength development. So individual studies have not influenced my belief much. It really is up to these meta-analyses to see if we can, using statistical wizardry, find out if there are trends in these data that individual studies don't find to be statistically significant, but maybe in a meta-analysis we can tease out there are still some benefits. So it depends on how much stock you put into these types of statistical exercises, and this new meta-analysis also was one of these cases. Another new line of research is the indicator amino acid oxidation research, the IAAO method. We have 3 reliable studies that looked at protein requirements based on this method. This is basically a method that looks at the protein intake that's required to maximize whole body protein synthesis. This is not necessarily a protein intake that maximizes muscle growth. That might be lower because it's possible that some protein synthesis can still be increased in collagen or connective tissue or other tissues than muscle mass, but still it's a very reasonable proxy. The first study by Van Degen et al. In 2017 estimated a protein intake of 1.7 gram per kilogram, maximized average whole body protein synthesis on non-training days in male bodybuilders. So this was right in line with the data that we had at the time. In 2019, Malowani et al. Estimated a protein intake of 1.5 gram per kilogram per day, maximized average whole body protein synthesis on training days in female lifters. So that's even lower than the protein intakes required based on this other research. But then in 2020, Mazula et al. Estimated a protein intake of 2 gram per kilogram as necessary to maximize whole body protein synthesis. But this was in training days in male bodybuilders. On training days, we know the protein synthesis is higher because that's when you're at the peak of the anabolic window. And individual studies show that we can have more protein in that period and it will increase protein synthesis. So when you look at just the anabolic window period, the post-workout time, you extrapolate that to your total protein requirements on average across the day, you're going to overestimate your protein requirements. In that sense, the 2 on training days and maybe 1.6 on rest days would fit perfectly with an average of 1.8. In fact, if you look at the range here, it's 1.5 to 2 based on the 3 studies that we have on this, and that fits perfectly with the available other data that we have. I'd also note that the new method is better than nitrogen balance, but is also absolutely not perfect, and the assumptions and the calculations used significantly influence the estimates. For that reason, some people look at the confidence interval around the estimate and go with the higher end of the 95% confidence interval. And they will argue that this is because of individual variation in protein requirements. This is flawed. The confidence interval is influenced not just by individual differences in protein requirements, but also by the error of the measurement technique, by whether the subjects slept well, by how hard they trained, by how much protein they had in the days before, whether they were cutting or bulking, not just their individual actual physiological protein requirements. So yes, you could argue based on the uncertainty in the data, we're not just looking at the question, what is likely the optimum protein intake, but we're looking at the question, what could conceivably be the highest protein intake that could be used to maximize our gains? That's a bit of a different question. It's all about the level of margin of safety that you want, in this case, to maximize your gains. So again, you could use these estimates that I mentioned earlier based on the current meta-analysis, whether it's worth it for you to increase your protein intake substantially, to see if the effort and money for the protein is worth the potential addition in gains. All in all, regardless of whether we look at randomized controlled trials, whether we look at nitrogen balance data, or the indicator amino acid oxidation methods data, most of those research findings are in line with a protein intake about 1.8 gram per kilogram per day or 0.8 gram per pound that will maximize gains in fat-free mass. This is the minimum protein intake you have to consume every single day to probably maximize your gains. If we are looking at the highest level found in any breakpoint analysis or asymptotic research, then we're looking at the levels by Mazula et al. And Greg Knuckles, and that's 2 gram per kilogram. This is higher than any well-controlled randomized controlled trial actually supports. So we're really looking at a difference in the question of what level of protein intake maximizes muscle growth based on direct research versus what protein intake based on the limitations in the research could conceivably maximize muscle growth. And then we're looking at these higher ranges. For most individual purposes though, the additional gains you will get from increasing your protein intake above around 1.8 gram per kilogram will be very small. I'm going to conduct another meta-analysis based on the methods that I think are superior to see if there is in fact a benefit of higher protein intakes based on the available research. I don't know if the research will allow us to tease out that difference, but at this point, really, the controversy rests around the fact of how much margin of error and margin of safety you need to make sure that you're maximizing your gains. If you want a reasonable estimate, we're probably looking at the range of 1.6 to 2 gram per kilogram per day, or you could go with the old bell wisdom of 1 gram per pound if you want to be pretty safe. However, if you want to be like ultra safe and on your deathbed you think, oh, I really regret that I did not reach my natty max 1 month earlier than I could have, or I could have gained 1 kilo extra fat-free mass over the next 3 or 4 years, then you might want to go with the higher estimates of some of the researchers, like the current meta-analysis. If, however, you want the best reasonable estimate of what the likely optimum protein intake is, you're looking at a level of 1.6 to 2 gram per kilogram based on most research. And then yes, there is a small chance of missing out on a small amount of gains. The research simply does not allow us to say with 100% accuracy, this is the optimum protein intake for anyone. This is exactly how much you should consume. It doesn't work that way. There will be differences based potentially on body fat level, potentially on biological sex, almost certainly based on things like muscle memory, whether you are a vegan, the level of protein quality in your diet, and individual variants. So unfortunately, based on the current data, we cannot give a hard one-size-fits-all number. I know many of you want that, but it's simply not how science works. If this type of evidence-based content does not make you depressed or bored, I'd be honored if you like and subscribe.